Silvia.
Good afternoon and a warm welcome to today's seminar, which I am very pleased to chair. My name is Silvia Talavera Lodos, and I am a PhD candidate at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. Our distinguished guest, Dr. Erika Arban, will be presenting her book titled Italian Regionalism and the Federal Challenge, Reconciling Economic Regionalism and Solidarity, an insightful vision of the unique Italian model, which explores and theorizes economic regionalism. Erika Arban is a senior research associate at the Center for Comparative Constitutional Studies at Melbourne Law School. Following Dr. Arban's presentation, we will have the pleasure of listening to two discussants, Giacomo Delledonne, Assistant Professor of Constitutional Law at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, and Jens Woelk, Full Professor in Comparative Constitutional Law at the University of Trento. Subsequently, we will open the floor to questions from our online audience during the Q&A session. And without further delay, I would like to invite Dr. Erika Arban to start her intervention. Erika, the floor is now yours. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Silvia, for the generous introduction. So before I begin, I would like to thank Giuseppe Martinico for organizing this webinar, for the kind invitation to join this webinar. I would like to thank Giacomo Delledonne and Jens Woelk for agreeing to engage with my work and act as discussants. And I would like to thank Silvia Talavera for chairing this session. And of course, I'm also grateful to all of you who are online today. So this is the cover of the book, and I would like to begin by briefly explaining the genesis of this monograph. The book is basically a revisitation of my PhD thesis. Now, because I completed my doctorate in Canada at the University of Ottawa, my dissertation was intended mainly for an Anglophone or international, that is non-Italian readership. In fact, my sense at the time, and we go a few years back now, my sense was that Italy rarely featured in comparative discussions on federalism and regionalism, and in general, very little was known Italian regional model outside of Italian borders. Then when I revisited the original manuscript to publish it as a book, the underlying goal remained basically the same, that is, contribute to spreading the knowledge of how the Italian regional model works and situate it in a comparative context. However, I also think that some of the chapters, or at least some parts of some of the chapters, may have some relevance and therefore be of interest also to Italian scholars who are interested, who work in similar theme. And I will get back to that in the rest of my presentation. So the book is virtually divided into two parts. I say virtually because there isn't really a part one and a part two, but the first three chapters in a way are somehow different than chapters 4 to 6. The first three chapters are meant to be quite general, whereas the last three chapters are perhaps a little bit more specific. However, there is a common theme that connects all the chapters. And this common theme is basically the socioeconomic gap between the north and the south of Italy. And I think this is a very relevant feature, a feature that has justified most discussions on regionalism in Italy. Although, of course, other reasons explaining regionalism exist, but I think that the socioeconomic gap particularly relevant. Now, let me delve a little bit more in depth into each of these chapters. So in chapter 1, I revisit theories of federalism, regionalism, sub-state nationalism, and claim that they have all played a role in shaping the Italian regional model. A key point that I try to make in this chapter is how to distinguish between a federal and a regional model, since Italy is considered a quintessential example of regional state. I argue that there are objective difficulties in categorizing regional and federal models. The distinction between the two is very subtle, and it's actually becoming more and more blurred, with a resulting contamination of one model with features and characteristics of the other. I also ask whether such classification has any practical utility if we consider that the same adjective regional, or regional as in regional state, seems kind of a fictitious one, since it doesn't appear anywhere in the Italian constitution. Furthermore, regional states share tensions that are very similar to those existing in classic federations. So strategies applied in one model can be exported to the other. For such reason, most recent literature tends to refrain from distinguishing between federations and regional models, preferring to embrace expressions like, for example, multi-tiered systems. So this is at least the approach of Sahadic or Popelier. In the last part of chapter 1, I then engage with theories of substate nationalism, because I believe they also played an indirect role, perhaps, in Italy, particularly in the late 1990s, when federal solutions were put back on the political agenda, particularly by Lega Nord, and they were basing such claims for more decentralization on an alleged difference, ethnic difference between the North and the South. Moving on to chapter 2, chapter 2 narrates the history of Italian regionalism from the time of Risorgimento until the 1970s, when regions were finally implemented. So it covers a period of time of about 100 years or so. My argument in this chapter is that in order to fully understand all the debates on federalism and regionalism as they have taken place, both at the time of the Constituent Assembly and then again in the 1990s, we need to go back to how federalism was understood in the 19th century. I discussed at length the federal ideas of two thinkers, Carlo and Gaetano Salvemini. Now, while I'll acknowledge that other thinkers advocated federal solutions for Italy at the time, for example, Ferrari, Rosmini, Gioberti, I chose to focus specifically on Cattaneo and Salvemini for very simple reasons. Cattaneo, because his federal vision for Italy, but also for Europe, still resonates today, is still very valid today. And then I chose Salvemini because he advocated, at least in the first part of his intellectual production, he advocated federal solutions to foster the socioeconomic development of the South. And this sharply contrasts, in my opinion, with the common idea that is common today, that is federalism would compromise rather than foster the economic development of the South. Then chapter 3 continues to retrace the history of Italian regionalism and focuses particularly on the discussions and events that have occurred before and after the constitutional reform of 2001, of which I offer a detailed account article by article. I then briefly comment on some more recent developments, the developments that have occurred in the last 15-20 years, including the ongoing debate on differential regionalism and on the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, the PNRR. In the chapter, a key claim that I make is that, again, the socioeconomic gap between the North and the South situates the Italian case study in a unique position compared to other experiences, where federalization or regionalization claims have been pushed mainly by ethno-linguistic, cultural, or religion reasons. Moving on to the virtual second part of the book, chapters 4 to 6, these chapters discuss some very specific and, in my opinion, quite unique features of Italian regionalism that I believe may have broader relevance and be of interest in comparative perspective. But as I was saying before, I think that some of the themes that I discuss in this chapter, in these chapters, may be of relevance also to an Italian readership. So basically what I do here, I exploit, if I can use this word, I exploit some of the debates as they have taken place in the Italian context, so that they may become valid points of discussion on a larger comparative scale. Specifically, chapter 4 takes the North-South socioeconomic gap as the starting point to describe and theorize economic regionalism in constitutional law. Now, I borrow the expression economic regionalism from the social sciences, where this concept has been extensively studied, and where it is used to describe a constellation of different situations, but in particular to describe those instances where economically wealthier regions mobilize politically in order to acquire increased powers and autonomy. So in other words, and again, this is a definition borrowed from the social sciences, economic regionalism addresses the role played by economic factors in territorial politics. We may recall that the mobilization of northern regions to acquire more powers, especially in the fiscal sector, was one of the elements that propelled the discussion on constitutional reforms in the late 1990s. I also draw parallels between economic regionalism and sub-state national theory. In other words, I try to identify what I believe are points of convergence and divergence between the claims made for more autonomy in economic regionalism and the struggles, so the claims for constitutional recognition made by sub-state nations based on their ethno-linguistic, religious, or cultural distinctiveness. And I conclude that the two types of claims often coalesce, or the two economic regionalism and sub-state nationalism often coalesce, because claims for recognition of ethno-linguistic, religious, or cultural distinctiveness often hide claims for more economic powers. So the two often coalesce. In chapter 4, I also discuss two mechanisms, that is constitutional asymmetry and subsidiarity, claiming that they can be used to accommodate claims for more autonomy coming from economically wealthier regions. In doing so, I directly build on the Italian case study, where, as we know, asymmetry and subsidiarity are both constitutionally entrenched. Then in chapter 5, I describe an important concern that always emerges when we discuss economic regionalism, that is the reconciliation of requests for more autonomy made by economically wealthier regions with general principles of fairness, equality, solidarity. So, in other words, the moral legitimacy of such claims. And this is something that I also discuss in chapter 6. Again, as we know, in the Italian context, solidarity-based concerns have always been a theme for discussion, something that has always emerged when discussing regionalism and federalism. To this end, I build on some of my previous work on solidarity, and I explore the several facets of this principle, both in general terms and also in relation to federalism, where I contend there are at least three different limbs of this concept. So in the federal context, solidarity can be understood as federal loyalty or Bundestreue. Solidarity can be understood as brotherhood as fraternity, and then solidarity can be understood as equalization, so everything that can be traced back to fiscal federalism. I offer a brief comparative survey of how this principle is entrenched in a number of multi-tiered constitutions, including, of course, Italy. And the conclusion that I reach is that differently from a common belief that we have in Italy, federalism and solidarity do not need to be considered as antithetical concepts, meaning that federalism does not clash with solidarity. Rather, they both serve different but complementary purposes. Federalism brings together unity and diversity, while solidarity strengthens, solidifies the family-like relationships that connect the various actors of a federal model. Finally, in chapter 6, I bring together federalism theory, economic regionalism, sub-state nationalism, and solidarity. And I raise a number of questions, such as, for example, why is it important to acknowledge the existence of economic regionalism? Or is there a legal or moral obligation to accommodate the interests of economically strong regions? Most importantly, how can this be done in ways that protect the integrity of the state? Now, this same set of questions, or very similar questions, have already been asked by scholarship in regard to sub-state nationalism. So I think it was time to start raising these questions also in the context of economic regionalism. So while in previous chapters, my observation point was that of the economically strong regions, in the final chapter, I broaden the perspective and include also the viewpoint of the statewide community. In particular, I identify three reasons that I believe support the necessity to take claims for more autonomy in economic regionalism more seriously. The first reason are reasons of principle. So this principled argument suggests that if such claims are felt real by economically wealthier regions, then this makes them real. So if a given legal system has the potential for being flexible, then flexibility should be employed. The second reason are, as I call, reasons of prudence. So it's a prudential argument, a cautionary argument. And this argument proposes that economic asymmetries need to be taken more seriously in order to avoid the emergence of sentiments of discontent, disharmony, intolerance to the rules. In fact, especially at challenging economic or political circumstances, it is often the case that discontent and frustration grows. And this can lead to situation of crisis, particularly threats to the integrity of the state in the form of secession threats or exit threats, and the rise of populism. So the argument is that in order to avoid the emergence of these threats to the integrity of the state or the rise of populism, it would be prudential to take claims for more autonomy seriously and not just simply dismiss them. And then the third argument is to unlock the willingness of economically stronger regions to show solidarity. So I go back to this principle of solidarity, because I argue that the willingness of these regions to recognize the needs of other regions may be affected by the ability of the state to recognize the needs and distinctiveness of economically wealthier territories. So the two are somehow connected. And then again, this raises in turn other questions, such as, for example, do richer regions have a duty to help the rest of the state, and where is this principle grounded? Here, my argument is that federal solidarity represents the legal basis on which certain behaviors on the part of better off regions shall be expected. This means that accommodation shall not go in one direction only. There is a delicate exercise of reconciliation that should be done. And so the national territory as a whole should be considered. Similarly, too much emphasis on asymmetry and not enough on common values would raise the question of social cohesion. So it is important not only to pay attention to the asymmetrical interests of the the economically stronger groups, but also find points of reconciliation between them and general principles of equality, fairness, and most importantly, solidarity. The component units of a multi-tiered system are like members of a family, and so they are bound by reciprocal rights and duties. But these rights and duties should not be unidirectional. They should not run only vertically, but also horizontally in a continuous do ut des. Whatever their nature, asymmetries bring inequalities, but when constituent units are bound by a duty of federal loyalty and solidarity to each other, economic asymmetries do not necessarily work to the disadvantage of worst off territories. And finally, can this duty of federal solidarity be forced or superimposed? Otherwise said, what happens if it is not the project of wealthier regions to help the others? And my argument is that the entrenchment of federal solidarity is, of course, very important, but not simply as an aspirational principle. This would not be sufficient to achieve the goal. The concept of solidarity needs to be given some concrete meaning and be translated into actual legal stratagems. Otherwise, the risk is that it remains a sterile ideal. So, and I conclude here, federal solidarity in the three meanings that I mentioned before: federal loyalty, brotherhood, and equalization, represents the legal foundation upon which certain rights and duties shall be expected from all the component units. So I stop here. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Erika, thank you very much for your very interesting and clear presentation. Now I give the floor to the first of the discussants, who is, if I am not wrong, Giacomo Delledonne.
Well, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Silvia. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have an opportunity to discuss Erika's monograph. Some relevant points have already been mentioned by Erika herself in her presentation. The Italian regional model is a quite relevant one, but it isn't so well known outside Italy. Therefore, works like this monograph, or even the book edited by Erika with Giuseppe Martinico and Francesco Palermo a couple of years ago, are so precious, so useful for spreading the knowledge of the Italian regional model outside Italy. I will say something more about the comparative relevance of this topic in a couple of minutes. Now, my first point is a methodological point. A great strength, in my opinion, in Erika's book is that she focuses pretty much on the role of ideas, of political actors, of thinkers, philosophers in shaping the development, the evolution, possibly also, let's say, the crisis of the Italian regional model. So this is quite important. I would say it reminds me of the Italian doctrine of the Constitution in the material sense. In order to understand how a regional or a federal model works, you have to focus on the role of the dominant political actors, of the dominant legal and political ideas in shaping the evolution of the state, regions, municipalities relations. And here comes a problem. Erika mentions the role of the Italian political parties in the first stage of the history of the Italian Republic, most of all the Christian Democrats and the Communists, in fostering the emergence of a specific conception of regionalism, a pretty unitary one. And she makes reference in multiple passages to the emergence of the League. Now we are faced as political scientists, but also constitutional law scholars like Marta Cartabia and Nicola Lupo put it, we are faced with a destructured political system. We witness the rise of abstentionism in elections. We witness a great volatility in voting behavior. We witness the rise and quick decadence of political parties like the Five Star Movement, Matteo Salvini's League, which is not the same as the Northern League in the 1990s, etc. So my first point is, how do you see can you think of the evolution of our regional model in the next few years, having in mind the political and legal framework? In my view, this is quite important in order to, let's say, trace some possible directions for the evolution of our model. The same happens to, let's say, in a smaller scale in the special regions, but this is an entirely different side of the story. Another point has to do with the object of your research. In a way, so this is possibly as you have already said, this is the most original component of your research. You emphasize the role of the North-South divide, of bridging the gap in influencing, for better or for worse, the evolution of the Italian regional model. In a way, the history of the Italian regional model is also the history of the Constitution of the Italian Republic. And in this respect, I'm making reference to the implementation of the principle of equality as entrenched in Article 3 of the Constitution. If we consider the debates in the Constituent Assembly in 1946-47, we notice immediately that national unity was a key concern during the debates in the Constituent Assembly. So creating equality, bridging the gap between the North and the South, fostering national unity. also with an eye to secessionist attempts in some parts of the country. And what happened later confirms the starting point. You focus on the quite late implementation of ordinary regions in the 1970s. The 1970s were a decade in which the tax system was reformed in order to make it more unitary, more uniform throughout the territory. The 1970s were the decade in which the National Healthcare Service was established in 1978. So the launch, the establishment of ordinary regions in the 1970s coincided with legislative reforms that were more or less closely related to it, and which created favorable, very favorable conditions for a quite uniform model of regionalism. The underlying idea was that in order to promote equality, equality among citizens, equality among territories, you had to promote uniformity, uniformity throughout the Republic, uniformity throughout the Italian region. In the 1990s, another idea emerged. That's why it's so important to focus on the strength of ideas in influencing the relevant actors. That is, in order to create equality, you have to admit that differences exist. Therefore, uniformity is not the most suited tool in order to provide for greater equality. That's why some ideas regarding autonomy, asymmetry, fiscal federalism in the broadest possible meaning emerged in the Italian debate. In my view, just like in my previous point, now we are in a sort of, let's say, dead spot. We think that there are some merits to asymmetry, to the claims for greater autonomy. We also think, we tend to think, many of us tend to think that there is a problem with, let's say, uniform or comparable standards, living standards throughout the Italian territory. This feeling was, of course, strengthened by the handling of the pandemic. In this respect, this uncertainty, of course, casts a shadow on what we want to do with our regional model, what we want to do with claims for greater autonomy. Uncertainties here are quite significant. So we witnessed a number of regions, even outside the north, initiating procedures for applying for a more favorable autonomy regime. And after that, they seem to change their mind. So I think the relation between equality, uniformity, differentiation, and of course, what we think of our regional model is a crucial point right now. Third point. Until now, I have mostly spoken of developments since the establishment of the Italian Republic, since the entry into force of the Constitution of 1947. An important point in your book is that you emphasize pretty much the relevance of thinkers in the 19th century, of lawmaking, let's say, legislative debates after the national unification in 1861, subsequent debates, so the relevance of thinkers like public intellectuals like Gaetano Salvemini, Luigi Sturzo, and so on. And there's another point I would like to mention, to highlight here, borders. So how we define sub-state territorial units. It's a point you sort of mention, for instance, when you discuss the role of metropolitan cities, in many respects, we still rely on borders that were conceived in the 19th century. Even so, the Italian regions were provided for by the Constitution in 1947, and they were based on the regions that had been let's say, created for statistic purposes in 1860. There's a curious anecdote which was mentioned by Sabino Cassese some time ago, that the Gasperi cabinet was discussing the implementation of the regions in 1949, which they didn't finally do. And the foreign minister, Carlo Sforza, said, well, we shouldn't focus so much on regions. We should focus on provinces. Who in the earth in Piacenza knows what is Emilia? Emilia was an invention of Luigi Carlo Farini, the prime minister in 1862. So there is, let's say, how could I say, a path dependence, which goes back to the very establishment of the state and which still influences our debates. So metropolitan cities are so, let's say, eccentric in many respects, also because they are based on the old provinces, and the provincial borders, in many cases, not in all cases, were based on provincial borders in the 19th century. A fourth and possibly final point, populism. And here my question has to do with the debate, current debate, a topical debate right now about how to enforce Article 116, paragraph 3 of the Italian Constitution. Here, I think we are faced with a double dilemma. On the one hand, I think that the Italian debate, with some quite notable exceptions, seems to ignore the function of asymmetry in the way multi-tiered system actually work. So there's a need to, let's say, promote a greater awareness of what asymmetry is about in a scenario like the Italian scenario. On the other hand, we should also be aware of the flaws, sometimes even the major flaws of the current constitutional framework, in that it apparently allows regions to seek greater autonomy in all the available subject matters, in that it doesn't provide for a, let's say, sufficiently precise procedure for getting greater autonomy, and it ultimately seems to favor, let's say, all or nothing approaches, which is quite evident, for instance, in the declarations and the statements by some of the political actors involved. So my question is, what would you suggest when it comes to regulating differential asymmetry, the access to asymmetric autonomy, in order to civilize the debate, to weaken the appeal of populist claims, and so on? And my very final point is, what is, in your view, what are, in your view, the aspects of the Italian regional model which are, let's say, of relevance for, let's say, a foreign audience? Of course, in Italy, there is much scholarship on which systems influenced our model. Spain, Austria, the German understanding of subsidiarity, English local government in the 19th century, if you wish. So my question is, what are the most interesting aspects right now of the Italian regional model, which might be of interest in the, let's say, global comparative constitutional conversation on these topics? So thank you, and thank you for giving me a chance to discuss these issues.
Thank you very much for your intervention. Now I give the floor to our second discussant, Professor Jens Woelk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Erika, compliments for this great book. I start with this value judgment immediately because, and then I will, of course, give my the reasoning for it, because I wanted just to follow up on two things Giacomo has said, because I think they have struck me, and I think this is also not, of course, a dialogue between discussants, but I think a way of connecting. I think we are in the dead spot, you said, Giacomo. I think this is a very important issue, and also Erika mentioned it. I will come to this at the very end. I have in mind this book, which probably many of us know, Il pendolo e la livella, which is in the first part on the regional system, the pendulum, so that Italians don't have a clear idea what this regional system of government is actually for. And on the other hand, the La Livella, so leveling regarding the municipalities, which then, of course, for the large municipalities, as Giacomo also has referred to, poses the problem of the metropolitan cities, which do not fit in, and you need to create a category and so on. So I think this just for setting, in a way, the stage for the book, which is that it talks about something which ought to be clear, but is probably not clear, and is also seen differently in different decades, very differently, not differently, very differently, pendulum. So one from one side oscillating to the other side. The second point, which is in a way might be related, is what Giacomo said on we rely on borders conceived in the 19th century. I would say not only, we also rely on concepts conceived in the 19th century or even earlier. And of course, to some extent, this is a problem. And actually, regionalism compared to federalism is, as least as Erika puts it here in her book, in a very flexible and creative way, it's a means of, in a way, adjusting, adapting something which comes from the federal toolbox to different realities. She says federalism is an umbrella term. It means different things in different contexts, quoting Palermo Koestler. And then she said regional states are examples of how federal features have been adjusted to forge specific models. And I think this is good because she also puts this clearly, because very often in federal discourse we have the bias through a US-centric federal vision, and this is put here very clearly, and also in the comparative part there's always contrasted the US model with the other models, which is very, very useful. But now I have also to sort out a bit, not to repeat things. I think when she's mapping elements which are characteristic for a regional system at the very beginning, which is of course useful to do, there is this very provocative formulation: regional states can be thought of as incomplete or imperfect federal systems. So this is a kind of the idea which Häberle once called the little sister or little brother of federalism is regionalism. How does this matter for the book? It matters because probably the regional system have the greater challenge to cope with for various reasons I will come to in a moment. This is here the focus not so much on ethno-national identity, forming and framing debates on sub-state nationalism, as it is also very clearly explained in the book, but the idea, and this is a preparation in the first part in the theoretical framework, of putting the political economic types of asymmetry to a similar level in terms of importance for the system as the ethno-national ones, which are widely recognized and analyzed and dominate, of course, all the debate on diversity, as it is rightly said. I would add probably also part or consequence of the US federalism type bias, no? Where everything is symmetrical and you cannot talk about different nations within the US and so on. But on the other hand, it's also true, if we look at the 19th century in particular, that nation states and conflicts usually have their roots in ethno-national differences rather than in economic differences. Of course, there are exceptions, and this is also part of the book. So in this sense, Erika says this, spells this out very clearly, some forms of economic regionalisms are very similar if they acquire some kind of identity or something similar related quality, probably. You know? So this is necessary in order to have these economic asymmetries achieving the same relevance as elsewhere. In particular, this is true where this regards the integrity of a system. And so here, Erika always talks about the integrity of the state. I would, in this sense, maybe say of the whole system, because I think we should talk about elements and within the system. And of course, when I talk about elements within the system, I also imply that these elements have a conscience, that they are part of the system. So here we have already a first step towards maybe something which Erika is also very much interested in. So what is the added value? What is the kind of federal culture, federal spirit? So these kind of soft factors which you cannot totally grasp also from the simple constitutional charter. This could be, in a way, an answer also to these identity factors, or intention with these identity factors we talked about before. Now I'm a bit off my scheme, which I had prepared, because but let me make a compliment to the theoretical framework in the first chapter, because I think this is very broad on one hand, but also very well written and very useful as an overview, as an introduction. Could also be used for a course, for example, in order to go deeper into the general debate, which is here also supported by a very, very rich literature list. This goes for practically all chapters, but I think in particular for the first one. And this is something which is certainly a strong quality of the book. I wanted to talk about many things. I think the chapters 2 and 3 are also excellent in their short and efficient reconstruction of the past, present, and Erika says also the future, but we will see, maybe with question mark, obviously, of Italian regionalism. And I think, again, this is especially for a foreign reader very detailed, because what you can usually find in an Italian chapter is much less in an edited volume. The chapter 4 also on economic regionalism. Here, my question would be, as I'm sitting here in Trentino, South Tyrol, about this. This is a detail, but maybe an important detail, especially for your angle, about the special autonomies and this Milan and Rome Treaty, accord, which has been, which is probably, according to your distinction, something which is rather monetary compensation than equalization, because the very scope of this agreement is that the special autonomies actually carry out more competencies on their own without asking for the financing of this. So in this sense, it's not a monetary compensation, but probably the logic is rather this, as you put it there, no? And then the solidarity chapter. I think this is a very important chapter because here is the issue where the requests for more autonomy are discussed. And how is it possible? Is it possible to reconcile economic regionalism with the principles of fairness, equality, and solidarity? Here, I think the the author says that it's compatible because federalism reconciles unity and diversity, and I quote, solidarity fortifies the family-like relationship among subnational entities. So here, this, for me, I like this comparison, but I would probably rather go for the idea of federalism as a system. And if you see it as one system, I think then it is clear, as I said before, that the elements need to feel also part of such a system. And the question is whether this idea is stronger in federal systems compared to regional ones due to the dominant position of the central state in the regional system. And here a test question could be, has anything changed in this regard in Italy after 2001? No, where we were talking about the federalization of Italy and the reform of the state-regional relations. And here is something which is not very prominent in your book, I'm afraid, but I think it's important, and this is always the issue of participation. In the first part, you mentioned participation. You mention it, and you say that regional systems usually go to apply alternative solutions, you call it, with the conferences. No? The question is whether this is sufficient for including and for fostering the integrative function in the sense that the elements feel themselves and act as elements of a system. And an interesting part is also, which is now also discussed regarding the potential reforms, in particular here in our region, of course, the special autonomies, is the question of the participation in constitutional amendments, which is by some seen as the essence of a federal system compared to a regional system. Here, I would say, at least regarding the own special position within the system, this could be a kind of bridging element between both. And then, again, always looking into this federal spirit, as Michael Burgess has called it, and this kind of federal culture which might make a difference. Of course, you also use it in the theoretical chapter as the criterion for distinction, although you admit that it's very undefined and even blurred. But of course, there's also something where this becomes a constitutional principle, and this is the Bundestreue and other related principles, as you point also out in a very important and interesting comparative summary part I think it's on pages 140 something. And the question whether it's solidarity or only reciprocity. And the important question, which have been touched also in your presentation, whether and how to derive concrete active duties from such a principle, which in a way is related to a federal culture, but also in some reconstruction of the German Bundestreue principle, because there was the problem to apply a monarchic principle of origin in a democratic context. So in more recent reconstructions, it's very often related to the principle of good faith, which is a general legal principle, and of course should it's clear that the more so it should also apply between members, elements of a system. Bene. Probably there are also different seasons here in the single systems. You take this, of course, in your reconstruction of the Italian case, but I would say the same is true in Germany when we discuss fiscal federalism and active duties to financial solidarity deriving from the Bundestreue, and there are judgments from the Constitutional Court. In Germany, we can see that there is a strong difference before unification in the early 90s, after unification, and now, of course, we have, in a way, a very similar sequence of discussion and debate regarding the European Union level, where we also discuss about financial solidarity, and the discussion is, of course, very much influenced by the general context after the economic and financial crisis, for example. I have a lot of more points because I think what I want to stress still is that I have already talked about the strength. I have a list of strengths here, but I have already said this. Maybe the weakness, one of the weaknesses, of the very few weaknesses, is exactly this point with the EU. Of course, you cannot do everything in 200 pages. But maybe you also refer to the implementation, for example, of the Recovery and Resilience Program, the PNRR, and also to some extent to the pandemic. So the important questions are raised, but maybe this would also be helpful in order to see how do these systems behave within a larger multi-level system. And also you mentioned also the solidarity in the EU system. So I think this would be also a question where you could complete your studies usefully. I come to the conclusion. My conclusion is that the book is very helpful, factual, and detailed. So this is the great strength. It raises the right questions, including the main one: what is federalism and regionalism all about? Because I think this is the very question also for this system. And in a way, also a kind of answer to Giacomo's "we are in a dead spot" in the book. You say that the present state, I quote, of Italian regionalism is confused and its future trajectories are hard to predict. Also because centrifugal forces coexist with a rather strong centralism among political parties. Now I would ask, are there any centrifugal parties left apart from South Tyrol, where certain this is a question. The question is whether the unitary centralist political and general culture did not prevail in Italy, and probably one of the reasons is that there is not a national forum for regional politicians and regional interests. So again, the participation issue, and that this also might have made it much more difficult to develop a kind of federal spirit regarding the integrative function. But maybe this is not too necessary, because the center is so strong that we will not see too much centrifugal forces at work. But it also raises a question: who might actually be now the main driver of this differential regionalism? Because the Northern League is not Northern anymore, or at least not only. Is it sufficient that there are some so-called governors who are the driving forces of this, or not? So this, I have a number of questions, but maybe I have spoken already for too long, so I can maybe ask some questions if there are no others later. Thank you so much, and compliments for the book again.
Thank you very much for your intervention. So, Erika, would you like to respond to the points raised by the discussants?
Yes, thank you, Silvia, and thank you, Giacomo and Jens, for all your points. I mean, I wrote down all your main points and questions. I hope I will be able to make sense of what I would like to say, and hopefully give you some meaningful answer, but I don't know if I will be able to do that. But let's start with you know, the point that you both have raised. So the fact that regionalism seems to be at a spell. So it is true. I mean, if we think about the type of political discussions that were ongoing back in the early 1990s until the constitutional reform, and the political debates currently in place, of course, the scenario has changed significantly. I mean, the type of questions and the type of discussions that were happening there then are not happening at the moment. So regionalism, reforms, federalism, I mean, these are all topics that do not feature in political debates anymore. So it is true that and I think I mentioned it somewhere in the book, there is also the economic context has dramatically changed in a way compared to the 19th. I don't nowadays, especially in the aftermath of globalization, I don't think that in the north there is this strong, or at least it is not as strong as it was before, the economic fabric of the territory. I mean, we know that many businesses, many enterprises have closed, so the context is has changed quite significantly compared to 25 years ago. But we have an institution with this regional form of model that has been strengthened in 2001. So in a way, at least in academic circles, we are still, debating about these themes and these topics. But of course, the context is very different. Where do I see Italian regionalism going? I mean, I don't know. I wish I had an answer, and I wish my answer and my hope would be to have a real regionalism in place in Italy. I don't think this will be the case, or this will happen anytime soon. I think that the main problem, and I think I have mentioned this in some other contexts as well. I think that one of the issues that we have in Italy is that regionalism is not a common project among all regions. So we have regions who have this strong autonomist vocation. And of course, these are the special regions. I would include also regions like Lombardia, like Veneto, because of their past history, but we also have regions who do not have this strong autonomist vocation. And so it is difficult to reconcile these opposing views towards the form of state, regional, federal, or unitary, because we have a very strong center, we have a very strong autonomist regions and territories, but at the same time we have equally regions that do not aspire to acquire autonomy, or their aspiration for autonomy is very mild, is very minimal. So I think this is a problem compared perhaps to other contexts where regionalization is a more common project. So this is what, in my opinion, has prevented the creation of a fully working what has prevented the creation of a federal state in Italy, because of these contrasting forces. So the aspirations of some regions are not shared by other regions, and of course the center goes perhaps with what is most convenient for them to keep more power. So I'm not very optimistic about the future of Italian regionalism, and also another reason, in addition to these autonomist versus non-autonomist ideas that we have, is also that politicians, I mean, are not, except perhaps for South Tyrol or for some small enclaves here and there, but politicians do not really grasp the basics of regionalism and federalism. And so the debate, when it occurs and the way it has occurred in the past, is quite confused, because there is no knowledge, substantive knowledge of what a federal model is, what a regional model is, what are the benefits, what are the drawbacks of the model. The discussion is also, at least from my point of view, quite superficial. They talk by using slogans, and this is not a constructive way to debate these issues. So again, the fact that politicians are unprepared when it comes to regionalism and federalism, and the fact that we have opposite interests at regional level makes me quite skeptical about the future of the Italian regional state. But I hope, to be wrong, because, I very much support decentralization and federalism. I wanted then to comment, and I apologize if I'm not going in the order that you asked the questions. Giacomo, you raised the issue of borders, of regional borders, and exactly. I mean, you say that we are borders conceived in the 19th century. I just want to say that I started reading for a different project that I'm working on. I started reading all the discussions as they occurred at the time of the Constituent Assembly, when members of the Commission were trying to make sense of creating regions, new regions. And I have to say, it's so interesting to read these debates. They were talking about the creation of regions that I had never heard before, like Daunia in Puglia, but then again, how to divide parts of Emilia and how to englobe them in northern Tuscany and parts of Liguria. So it was extremely interesting. But at some point, they said, we need to analyze the economic context of the regions that we want to create. We needed to explore, the population living in these areas, but we simply don't have the time to do that. We are under time pressure. In order to create regions that would be viable and functioning, we would need to take into the economy, and a sufficient number of people living in the regions to justify the creation of new regions, but we simply don't have the time to do that. So they basically relied on these pre-existing borders, except for the creation of a couple of regions, including mine. So it's a very interesting debate as it has taken place. But I mean, this also shows one of the issues and one of the problems of this of our system. Another point that you raise, I think, let me go to Jens. Jens, thank you very much for actually identifying the two weaknesses. Probably there are many others, but you pointed to two weaknesses of the book. And, while I was listening to you, I fully agreed with your points, participation and the relationship with the European Union. Actually, these are potential topics for further, discussions and further elaboration of what I wrote in the book. Let me say something about participation. It is true that certainly the absence of a federal senate or a regional senate, however we want to call, does not help the emergence of a regionalist sentiments among regions. I am totally with you on that, and also the fact that regions don't really have a say in constitutional change. At the same time, there are federal systems who don't have a federal senate, and I think of Canada, or where the constituent units do not really participate or do not have a direct role in constitutional amendment. So I agree, but I don't think that this is the only reason why a federal system or a regional system is successful or unsuccessful. However, participation is definitely something that is worth exploring more in depth and to determine to what extent this contributes to the successful and the functionality of a system. About the relation with the European Union, yes, I mean, it's only superficially touched and mentioned in the book. I think that particularly everything that has happened, I would say starting from 2011, the relationships with the European Union have significantly affected the way regionalism works, although previously in the 1990s, the fact that the European Union was putting so much emphasis on regions in the aftermath of the Treaty of Maastricht was propelling a little bit the discussion, was helping the discussion on regional reforms in Italy. But then starting, I would say, in 2011, and then we saw it very well with the pandemic and the economic crisis. The relationship with the European Union has affected in the negative, perhaps, the functioning of Italian regionalism. So I would have to, to think a little bit more about that. But these are certainly very interesting points that might be worth exploring a little bit better. And then you ask also the question how to implement a federal culture, including solidarity. Yeah, this is also a very valid point, and I don't have a definite answer for that, but I guess it goes back to what I was saying during my presentation, and particularly when I was talking about solidarity. I think that having specific mechanisms, specific tools in the Constitution that reflect the idea behind solidarity or federal culture, however we want to call, these are all terms and expressions that share many similar points. I think that it would help. How this can be done? Yeah, there are some examples drawing from especially the German experience. They could be reproduced or changed, or they could function as inspiring elements, but then they would have to be tailored, made and adapted to the Italian context. What else? Yes, there was another point that Jens, and I'm sorry again for jumping from one discussant to the other. You were making the point, Jens, about whether in a federal system the sense of belonging to the state as a whole is stronger as opposed to regional states, and whether this is something that distinguishes the two. And I agree, if I understand your question correctly, I agree with you. And I think I make this point in the book somewhere. I think that in those countries like Italy, but Spain is another very good example. South Africa is another good example. When this sense of federal belonging or federal belonging is not very well developed, when there is resistance towards the idea of federalism, then a regional system comes into play, but it takes very different names and definitions that tend to avoid any ism or any relation to the federal term. So Estado autonómico, cooperative government, devolution, if we look at the UK or even Kenya, Sri Lanka, they were using similar terms. So yes, I think when the sense of belonging is not as deep and when there is resistance for some reason towards federal ideas, then something else comes into play, something else is created, and it can take different names. I don't know if I have more time to speak and comment or answer all your questions. Sylvia, let me know if I should stop here or and maybe go back later to some of the points that were raised. If there are other questions, perhaps.
I see that there are some questions in the chat, so I don't know if you prefer to answer these first and then come back to...
Yeah, maybe let's answer some of the questions and then I can go back if we still have time to some of the points made by Jens and Giacomo.
Okay, I see the first question is from Ishil. I would like to ask you, Ishil, if the only problem is the camera, could you ask the question if your mic is working? If not, I can say it out loud. But if it's possible for you to speak, or maybe not. Okay, so I will read the question. So Ishil asks if something on politics of economics. Can you see the question in the chat, Erika?
Yes, I'm trying to read it.
If I may, sorry if I jump in. For the recording, it would be necessary in any case to read the question in order to understand the exchange. You know, I mean, for those who will watch this on YouTube. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so I can read it out loud if you don't mind, Erika.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, of course.
Ishil would like to ask, since geography and economic factors are highly intermingled, if there is constitutional asymmetry, there would be also economic asymmetry between regions. And she would like to ask you how we can talk about regionalism in terms of economic factors, including solidarity, interdependence to each other.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for your question. I'm not sure I fully understand it. So let me just comment, and then if I'm not making sense or if I'm not addressing properly your question, please let me know and I will try to answer again. So
Erika, if you
yes.
prefer, I mean, since there are many questions in the chat, we could gather all the questions, you know,
Okay.
to give you the last say, right?
All right.
I don't know if the other colleagues who wrote their questions could open their mic and present themselves and ask, I mean, these questions also, again, for the recording thing. We have Esteban, I don't know, and Francisco, if I'm not wrong. To Francisco. Could you please?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I can read my question. So thank you everybody for these wonderful presentations. Also thank you, Erika, for this wonderful book. And my question is about solidarity and the role of equalization mechanisms, because I don't know if you think that the logic that these mechanisms within a federal or a multi-level system promote unity and cohesion is still valid today. Because, I don't know, I have the feeling that we are witnessing a trend in different countries. Take, for instance, Canada, Italy, or Spain, to take three countries you mentioned, where financial or economic factors are becoming the main catalyst of centrifugal tensions. And these mechanisms, instead of reducing these tensions, are enhancing them. So yeah, I wanted to if you could elaborate a bit more on that, as it's something that you also address in the book. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's collect all the other questions. So I don't know if Esteban can ask the question. You can open the mic. Or maybe I can read it out loud as well. Okay. Do you see a relationship between a weak or weakened development of shared rule institutions and economic disparities or lack of sufficient territorial cohesion in Italian regionalism? This is Esteban's question. And let me check. There are some comments by Jens in the chat regarding the previous intervention. Yes, please.
Now, I just wanted to add to the question the future dimension. So, in particular, in case a reform of differential regionalism would succeed, which is by no means certain from my point of view, in that case, would, and re-echoing, rephrasing Esteban's question, would some participation as at central level, participation at central level, would this help for the integrative function?
Okay, we have a question. Please, Cedric, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. I didn't type it into the chat, but indeed I had a double question. Also, thank you very much for the presentation, and I'm curious to read the book. The first question was concerning the representation and the position that was discussed within a potential Senate of the regions or of the sub-states. I was wondering to what extent also the fact that the evolution plays a role as well. I'm trying to connect back to one of the comments you said in the beginning, that the point is to make the book a point of reference for comparative research. So I'm also looking at it from the Belgian perspective, a Belgian being a federal state naturally. And for example, there we have a Senate which did not used to be a chamber for the sub-states, but by now it has become. It used to be just the second chamber. Now it is normal. It should be the place of gathering for the sub-states, and still it's not really considered to be a success story either. So they can voice, they have a say in changing the constitution, but because it hasn't been for such a long time, the law in the books might actually grant them the power, the voice there, but it's not considered to be a forum where they can really participate. So I was wondering to what extent could the perception of having participation also play a role aside from the legal participation? So that was my first question. The second question was on the notion of federal loyalty that you referenced to, and also Jens Woelk referenced to a couple of times. How can the Italian perception of solidarity or federal loyalty influence other countries as well? And more particularly, I was thinking of a recent advisory opinion of the Belgian Council of State, in which it stated that the federal loyalty only gives negative duties and not positive obligations. And what could you share about that from the Italian experience or from your comparative research? I've always found it a bit questionable to divide between negative and positive, thinking back of human rights. So many negative obligations also have a positive obligation as the opposite side of the coin. But so the Belgian Council of State said, no, federal loyalty is only something which can be used to say, stop, you're making the exercise of my powers impossible or excessively difficult. You cannot use federal loyalty to improve or facilitate the exercise of another state's or sub-state's power. So I was thinking, I've always found that a questionable perception of federal loyalty, but from your comparative research now with the focus on Italy, could you add your perception on the dual fate status and the dual meaning of potentially of federal loyalty? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. So in case there are no further questions, I give the floor to Erika again.
Okay, thank you so much for all your questions. And as I was saying before, I hope I will be able to address all your points. So let me start perhaps with Cedric's question. So I start from the last one. So, and particularly with loyalty, I think that Belgium, I mean, from what I know, Belgium is perhaps because loyalty is also justiciable in a way. It is one of the few countries that perhaps has courts that actively engage with this principle, because the principle is entrenched in the constitution, and it's also justiciable. I think I would not agree with the Belgian court. I think that, or at least from my point of view, from the way I see solidarity, loyalty, this principle, as I consider that we're part of the same category. I think that loyalty or solidarity imply a set of rights and duties, and these are reciprocal. As I said, do unter des, at least that's how I perceive loyalty, and therefore I would not limit loyalty only to negative duties. I think it would entail positive duties as well. It would entail rights as well as duties. There isn't, at least from my research so far, there isn't an extensive case law actually on this topic, but I hope there will be more discussions also in case law about this principle, because then the interpretation of courts actually help better framing, principles that when they are just entrenched in the constitution have perhaps a very porous or blurred type of a meaning. So yes, I hope there will be more and more this at the doctrinal level, at theoretical level, but also at the level of case law, in order to fully or better, more completely, wholly understand this concept of a federal loyalty. And also about representation. Well, I think that, and this goes also to perhaps some of the points raised by Jens and by Esteban, I think. I think that, federal systems evolve, they evolve all the time. So we need to think of not just federal systems, perhaps also since we're on tiered systems. I think that we should see these systems as evolving all the time. So perhaps what was helpful and what was useful at a certain time, at a certain period, might not be useful or applicable 20, 30, 40 years afterwards. So one of the advantages, at least on paper, of a federal systems is that they are more capable of adapting to changing circumstances, and so they are more flexible, perhaps, to adapting and reflecting changed and changing circumstances. So they evolve and they adapt better to the different context in which they find the state finds itself. So yes, it would be, perhaps it's an ideal understanding I have of a federalism, but I think that we shouldn't be scared or worried too much if after a certain period of time we need to to change or rediscuss how participation takes place, how representation of subunits takes place, and discuss ways to improve that, either in a federal Senate as part of constitutional change and so forth. Let me see if I can go back to some of the other questions. Francisco, well, thank you for your questions. I know you work a lot on equalization mechanisms, and in my book, I only mention them quite superficially. I don't go into the depth of how equalization mechanisms work. You ask whether the logic that these mechanisms, the logic of these mechanisms is to promote unity and cohesion, but then if we look at the practical, the reality, well, they seem to work in the opposite direction. I think that what I was saying a moment ago with regards to participation can be applied also in the context of equalization mechanisms, in the sense that if you know, we need to make adjustments to how these equalization mechanisms work to actually the need for which they were introduced. We shouldn't be, you know, worried or afraid to do that. If we see that the way equalization mechanisms are functioning do not actually help reducing tensions, you know, we should be able to actually sit and ask how they could be improved in order to function in a more proper way. Of course, you know, maybe I speak from you know, a point of view of an ideal model, and we know that you know, the politics and you know, changing is always very very difficult. But yeah, that's how I see it. You know, that's how I answer to a question. Let me, sorry, go back to, I'm reading again. Okay, let me go to Isil. Sorry, I'm just. So Isil, you ask, you rephrased, thank you for rephrasing your question. You ask what is the relationship between different economic factors on differential regionalism. I'm not sure I can answer you. There is a very rich, as you also mentioned in the first question that you asked, there is a very rich scholarship that I haven't actually read in detail, particularly in political economy and the social sciences in general, but particularly in political economy, that discusses everything that is related to economic regionalism. Geography and economic, like you said, are strictly connected. I don't think that economic asymmetry per se is a problem. I mean, economic asymmetry exists everywhere, and it doesn't necessarily need to be addressed or reflected in the constitution in forms, for example, of economic asymmetry. Differences between territories exist. It's part of the nature of you know, a country, particularly larger countries, particularly dishomogeneous countries. So this is a fact, and I don't think it should be necessarily become a constitutional issue, bringing constitutional asymmetry. I suggest that this need to be taken into account only when this is a cause of tensions, of problems, of claims for more autonomy, but also keeping in mind the needs and the reality of other regions as well. So when we talk about economic regionalism, we also need to take solidarity mechanisms into account, because I think that addressing certain economic factors and economic issues at constitutional level also ask to compromise and balance also the needs of other territories which have a different economic fabric or economic texture. So I don't know if I actually answered your question. Let me see if I have addressed all the points that were raised. I was missing something. Oh no, there is one last question from Joe Gardiner. Would there still potentially be a place for localized governments in a more federal Italian model, or something more akin to Australia, 3 tiers instead of 2? Well, we have so local governments are part of Italian history. I was mentioning in my presentation I think the 19th century, he was supporting a federal solution for Italy, mainly for the reason that local governments, comuni, as they are called in Italy, they exist basically since the Middle Ages. So if we go back to the 1200, the 1300, we already have municipal charters, particularly in certain parts of Italy. And this basically, in his opinion, represented the most important reasons why Italy was federal at its core. So there is this long tradition of local governments in the Italian context, and we have local governments entrenched in the constitution, as we have metropolitan cities entrenched in the constitution, as well as provinces. So 3 different tiers of local governments, metropolitan cities, municipalities, and the point is that they are constitutionally entrenched, but then their powers are very limited at the moment. And also another point that has been discussed extensively is the number of these local governments, particularly municipalities, that makes it very difficult to manage. Also, provinces, in a certain way, there is a significant number of the metropolitan cities. We started with 10 metropolitan cities, and then others were added, and now there is also the risk that the very essence of what metropolitan city is defeated by the multiplication of these bodies, these institutions. So I think there is potential place for a more significant role played by local governments, but perhaps we should redefine the way local governments are structured. Okay, I think I can stop here.
Thank you very much, Erika. Sorry.
Yeah, I hope I have addressed in a certain way the questions that were asked.
Sure. So thank you very much for your time for this needed and very helpful book. I don't know if you would like to add something, Erika.
Let me see if sorry, if I can go back to questions that were Giacomo and Jens that I haven't, if I can find them. So Giacomo, you asked at some point I think I have indirectly addressed this question, but you asked at some point what I think are the most important aspects of the Italian regional model for a foreign audience. I think this is an interesting question. So I think that many of the debates, as they have emerged in Italy throughout the decades, in general, around regionalism, are very interesting and could be of, potential influence also elsewhere. I mean, the same classification between regionalism and federalism that was done back, in the 18th. It's that it's still debated today, and not just in Italy. I was doing some work on Sri Lanka at some point, and they were struggling with very similar questions and issues as we have been dealing in Italy for a long time. So these are very, very interesting discussions that are happening also elsewhere. What I think is very interesting about the Italian model is the entrenchment of metropolitan cities. You know that I've done some work in this field, but I'm not talking whether metropolitan cities work as they have been framed, but the idea of metropolitan city, I think, is very, very interesting, and should represent at a time where we're talking about cities and constitutional law. It could be a source of inspiration and influence in other systems. The extensive use of and discussions on asymmetry. Of course, I understand that not everybody agrees on the benefits of asymmetry, and as I said before, too much asymmetry probably is not a good solution. But the asymmetrical system that we have in place, and Article 116, third paragraph, giving opportunities to add to this asymmetry, are important aspects that relevant abroad, not to mention the principle of horizontal subsidiarity, which is related to federalism, but it could also be applied outside of a federal system. But this very idea of horizontal subsidiarity, as we have entrenched in the Constitution, is very interesting. So outside of these, or beyond these elements, these aspects that I have raised, I think that in any case, the whole discussions and the debates also on how to frame regions, as I was mentioning before, it's extremely interesting in talking about units, and how this is another topic that interests me. What would be the ideal size of units? What elements could be taken into account in creating viable units in a there are several aspects that could be of relevance for an international audience. I think I can stop here.
So thank you very much, Erika, and thanks to the discussants and to Stals for giving me the opportunity to chair this seminar. And also thank you to the participants. So I think we can close.